is John Denver inviting you to climb aboard and join us for a trip that can only be described as far out.
Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this podcast, we talk about the stories behind songs and legends, as well as moments in music history and history in the making. On October 12th, 1997, shortly after 5:00 p.m., a plane carrying the Rocky Mountain High and Take Me Home Country Roads legend, John Denver, unexpectedly dropped into Monterey Bay near Pacific Grove, California. While many were shocked to learn this news, some feared this day could be imminent. Many also questioned, was this actually an accident, or did John Denver do this on purpose? And if he did it on purpose, why would he do such a thing? John's love of planes and flying spanned over several decades leading up to this fateful day. In the last Roots episode, we talked about John Denver's childhood and how he was introduced to planes in the first place. In today's episode, we are going to dig deeper and we are going to be talking in depth about everything leading up to this tragic event. We're going to discuss the theories behind it, whether it was an accident, whether it was possibly intentional, and we're going to be revealing some details that are typically not discussed when talking about John Denver and this crash. I promise you, after this episode, you will never look at October 12th, 1997 the same. First and foremost, we must understand John Denver's father.
I hope you folks recognize me, but I'm not sure you recognize the gentleman on my right. He's my father, Dutch Dutchendorf. He's been a pilot all his life. He taught me how to fly. Simply couldn't do this film without him.
His father was, of course, a highly accomplished and decorated Air Force pilot who flew various fighter jet models during World War II, including but not limited to the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the B-24 Liberator. He also, and most notably, flew the Convair B-58 Hustler, which was the first operational supersonic strategic bomber capable of Mach 2 flight, which means capable of flying at twice the speed of sound. While his father was trained on and had flown multiple different fighter jets, the Convair B-58 was his specialty. Over the course of his career in the Air Force, Henry broke 5 world speed records in the B-58 and was inducted into the Oklahoma Aerospace Hall of Fame. When John Denver was just a 1-year-old baby, his father was sent to the U.S. Air Force Base in Japan. He had already been in the Air Force at that point for about 5 years, but this was certainly the furthest assignment he'd had to date. And of course, the timing with having a newborn son in Oklahoma was not ideal, but the family was so enormously proud of him that John Denver's mother was beyond supportive of her husband. She moved in with her parents in Corn, Oklahoma for the first year and a half or so of his assignment. You know, John was still very young and hard to travel with. But then when John got to be a little bit older, she then left Oklahoma to join her husband in Japan in 1947. And they stayed there for the last 18 months of his assignment. This was John Denver's very first long-haul flight as a little toddler and his very first real immersion into the commercial aviation industry. By the time John Denver and his parents came back from Japan, they were transitioning what had been the U.S. Army Air Corps to the organization we know and recognize today as the U.S. Army Air Force. While it may seem like this was just a technicality, a name change, if you will, of a government organization, this transition actually had a significant impact on John Denver's family. John's father, Henry, obviously embraced a career in the newly independent U.S. Air Force, but that also meant frequent military reassignments, and sometimes these were made with very short notice. The family moved dozens of times during John Denver's childhood as a result of this. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, John's dad was involved in multiple jet training programs in the U.S. Not only was he a decorated bomber pilot, but he also began spending more and more time as a flight instructor. He worked to immerse his son John in the aviation industry, and made a point to expose him to the fighter jet world specifically. But in John's adolescence and early teen years, he fought this opportunity to bond with his dad. He craved more of a free-spirited lifestyle, while his father demanded a very strict and regimented household. John often said he felt emotionally distant from his father in this regard. But at the same time, what teenager doesn't feel emotionally distant from their dad? This sort of started to change, though, when his dad did something in 1961 that even a rebellious teenage boy had to admit was pretty cool for their dad to do. Henry broke his first world record with the supersonic B-58 Hustler, moving at twice the speed of sound. He'd go on to do this 4 more times, by the way, but this was a big deal for his family in 1961. And John Denver was 18 years old by then, somewhat growing out of that teenage withdrawal. 5 years later, John Denver had moved to LA to pursue music, and his father officially retired from the Air Force. By then, John Denver was enormously proud of his dad, and his father had also accepted John's chosen life path to be a musician. And this is really when they started to bond over the Air Force and over fighter jets and everything that went along with that. But even though John started to bond more and more with his dad over Air Force things, he still made it abundantly clear to his family that aviation was a hobby and an interest for him, but music was his chosen career. 1966 was an important year for the Dutchendorf family, which I'm just now realizing I don't think I mentioned that their last name was Dutchendorf. His father's name was Henry Dutchendorf Sr. John Denver, before he changed his stage name, was Henry John Dutchendorf Jr. So 1966 was an important year for the Dutchendorf family. Not only did his father retire in 1966, but 1966 was also the year that John Denver's career was arguably officially launched. It was in 1966 John joined the Mitchell Trio, a group that would catapult him in the LA music scene. It was also in this year John started thinking about changing his name from Henry Dutchendorf Jr. to something a little bit more catchy, a stage name that would really stick. And in this year as well, he also started to write a little ditty, a song he called Babe, I Hate to Go. 3 years later, Babe, I Hate to Go had been officially renamed to Leavin' on a Jet Plane, and a stage name had been decided to be John Denver, his middle name being John, and of course, Denver, to reference the Rocky Mountains he so clearly loved in Denver, Colorado. While writing and pursuing his music career, John Denver also went home pretty frequently to visit his family. And when he did, he really enjoyed flying with his dad. His father became his main flight instructor. Flying, though, was still just a hobby for John. And by 1970, his song, Leavin' on a Jet Plane, had been recorded by Peter, Paul, and Mary and had already reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. John was quickly working to put out a second album and did so in 1970 with the album Take Me to Tomorrow. He also started to slowly tour across the US and began building a fan base specific to him, not just to his song, Leavin' on a Jet Plane. All of the hard work paid off in 1971 when his breakthrough album was released with the major hit, Take Me Home, Country Roads. This was also the year he decided to make Aspen, Colorado, his home. Take Me Home, Country Roads changed the game for John. He had already built a fan base with his first 2 albums, as mentioned, but the success of this song, being his own song off of his own album, now required John to expand his travels and tighten his schedule. It soon became abundantly clear to John Denver that he could reach more people if he could fly himself from point A to point B. And then came the year of 1974, a very pivotal year. First and foremost, it was in 1974 John Denver married his first wife, Annie Martell. The two decided to build a custom home in Aspen, Colorado, right near the airport. It was also in 1974 John Denver made his first airplane purchase, a Learjet Model 35. He also formed a company specifically to fly and operate this jet, which he designated as Windstar 1. The company was called Windstar Aviation. He appointed his father, Henry Dutchendorf, who went by the name Dutch, as the chief pilot. The Learjet was not only beautiful, but highly efficient. This was a really big moment for John to not only have the funding to do this from his musical successes, but also to have the experienced father and network to support this company. The Learjet Model 35 he purchased had been introduced the year before, in 1973. It was marketed as one of the fastest medium-haul business jets of the time. It was powered by two Garrett TFE 731 turbofans and could cruise at speeds over 424 knots, which, if you convert that to Machs, was about just over half a second speed of sound. If you remember a Mach 2 from Henry's fighter jet record, a Mach 2 went at 2 times the speed of sound. And that's a Mach 2. This Learjet was a Mach 0.69. The jet also accommodated 6 to 8 passengers and had nonstop ranges up to 2,056 miles. So it was ideal to fly himself and his crew to and from concerts. And that's exactly what they did for the next 10 to 12 years. This continued all the way through the mid-1980s. But even though the jet was technically deregistered from Denver's fleet in 1986, the jet actually remained in the family's possession and continued flights until 2012. While the Learjet was certainly a golden jewel, John Denver also purchased other smaller aircrafts for leisure. The second aircraft he purchased was soon after the Learjet purchase. It was a smaller Kristen Angle aerobatic biplane. He also purchased 2 other vintage biplanes and 2 Cessna 210s around the same time period. The Learjet was primarily kept in a private hangar that was owned by the Windstar Company in Aspen, Colorado, near his home. And there were at least 2 other planes he did keep at the Aspen-Pitkin County Airport here, but other planes would be at other regional airports throughout the country, California and anywhere else that he would frequent. It was also in 1974, John Denver released the single Back Home Again, which certainly helped recoup some of these big payments, winning the Country Music Association Award that year and also selling millions of copies. And for the next 15 years, John Denver and Annie lived a really great life. Annie and John adopted 2 children in the mid-70s, Zachary and Anna Kate. And John's music continued to do well, and he toured globally, consistently throughout the duration of their marriage, making him not just a national darling, but a full-blown global sensation. While a lot of this success was welcomed, a lot of it also put an enormous strain on his family life and his marriage with Annie. Fights started breaking out between John and Annie, surrounding money and John's touring schedule. In John's 1994 autobiography, he recounts the moment he and Annie were arguing about their divorce details, and John says how he took a chainsaw to their marital bed, the literal symbol of their relationship. He admitted it was an explosive and destructive reaction during an extremely painful time. And unfortunately, this chainsaw incident would not be the only destructive behavior that would come as a result of this divorce. This divorce from Annie in 1982 left John emotionally shattered. He began drinking heavily and self-isolating in the mid-80s. That, in combination with just a general shift in musical tastes, caused his career to enter a lull, to say the least. In his autobiography, he also said, quote, "I was lost during this time. I didn't know who I was if I wasn't Annie's husband or a superstar." In 1986, while still grappling with these issues, John met an actress and pop singer in Australia. Her name was Cassandra Delaney. 2 years after meeting, Cassandra and John married in a private ceremony in Aspen. And then in 1989, Cassandra gave birth to their daughter, Jessie Belle Denver. However, after just 3 years together, the two separated in 1991. Their divorce was finalized in 1993. I think the timeline here is important because now we are in the final years leading up to John Denver's crash. The two of them admitted the relationship was explosive and toxic. They said they loved and fought intensely, and the marriage was marked by dramatic emotional swings by both of them. It's also important to note there was a 17-year age gap between the two of them, and one of the primary points of frustration and friction for them was the fact that John Denver wanted that family-focused, nature-centered life in Aspen, Colorado, while Cassandra was from Australia, living in the States, was young and ambitious, and wanted to make it as an actress here. She didn't want that quiet, family-focused life. And this led to the ultimate breakdown of their relationship. It also led to a pretty ugly custody battle, but in the end, despite all of it, they did end up maintaining co-parenting of their daughter. And it was important to John Denver that he maintain co-parenting of Jessie. John said repeatedly that the best thing he ever did in this life was become a father. And in many ways, his prolonged periods of stability were solely due to his desire to be a good father to his kids. But after the second divorce from Cassandra, things became increasingly hard for John. The summer after John's divorce, he was out driving his 1963 Porsche just after midnight. It was August 21st, 1993, to be specific. He had been at the Renaissance restaurant having dinner and drinks when he was seen driving erratically down a street in Aspen on his way home. An Aspen police officer noticed he was weaving in and out of the lane lines and pulled John Denver over. John admitted he had 2 glasses of wine with dinner, and a breathalyzer recorded a blood alcohol concentration of 0.14, which was just above the legal limit at the time in Colorado, which was 0.1. So all in all, this was a very peaceful traffic stop. It was the first time he had ever been caught drinking and driving, and he was kind of just barely over the legal limit, seemed coherent, was definitely helping the officer and was being cooperative. So all in all, he was arrested on a DUI and was soon after released to the custody of one of his friends. John was eventually ordered to 28 hours of public service. He paid a fine of $407 in total and offered to do a benefit concert in Aspen, Colorado as part of these 28 hours of public service. After all, like I said, it was his first DUI, and this seemed like a fitting punishment. However, John Denver did not learn his lesson. In the same month, 1 year later, almost to the day, actually it might have been the same day, in August of 1994, a release is issued by the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office saying, quote, "Pitkin County deputies were called to Aspen Valley Hospital today to see a man who came in with injuries that he said were the result of a traffic accident. The Colorado State Patrol is investigating the accident, which occurred in Starwood, and the driver, who is identified as John Denver, suffered head and facial lacerations from the accident and is currently under investigation for DUI." So not only was this his second DUI incident, but this one was much, much worse. In this case, he had crashed his Porsche into a tree and had sustained serious head injuries as a result. But to make it even worse, well, I guess I don't know if you can make it even worse, but to make things worse, he was still under probation for the incident the year before. So he now faced a mandatory jail sentence of 7 days to 12 months. Not only that, but the Colorado Department of Revenue immediately suspended his driver's license as a result of this. A criminal DUI charge was also filed simultaneously in the Pitkin County Court. Now, John's attorney motioned and argued to dismiss the criminal DUI charges, arguing that a license suspension and a criminal prosecution would violate double jeopardy, essentially punishing someone twice for the same crime, which you cannot do. After his attorney made this motion, the judge halted his court hearing, which had been scheduled for like a month or two after this incident, the judge halts the court hearing to give the courts time to review the motion by his attorney and decide if this was indeed double jeopardy. Ultimately, the case and the charges were all dismissed, but not until June of the following year, which meant that for the remainder of 1994 and all the way through the first half of 1995, until June of 1995, John Denver was without a driver's license and in legal limbo for almost that whole year. But ultimately, the courts decided that they could not suspend his license and criminally charge him. It had to be one or the other. So the criminal charges were dismissed and John Denver was still just without his driver's license. 4 months after the criminal DUI charge was dropped and the judge sided with the double jeopardy claim, the FAA sent a very stern letter to John Denver. They demanded John Denver abstain completely from alcohol if he wished to maintain his pilot privileges. By this time, in October of 1995, he still had his pilot's license, even though he did not have his driver's license. But even though the FAA did not revoke his license at this time, they made it very clear that he was still under enormous scrutiny. And they were very clear he had to stop drinking entirely. After receiving this letter, John continued to fly and live his life, and he also continued to do public interviews, and ultimately got a little bit too chatty in these interviews. He admitted multiple times to the media from October of 1995, when he got that letter, to June of 1996, that he was still struggling with alcohol and had not quit and was not sober. The FAA obviously caught wind of this, so on June 13th, 1996, the FAA sent John Denver notice that he had failed to uphold his medical certificate, which, by the way, if you do not have a medical certificate with the FAA, you therefore do not have a pilot's license, and so consequently, his pilot's license became invalid. But alas, this did not stop John Denver from flying. Most of his flights after this were very short, and he certainly only tried to do them in somewhat stealth ways so as not to draw any attention to himself. But flying was his passion, and he just couldn't be kept away from it. And it wasn't just the actual act of flying that John Denver loved, but it was also the mechanics of various aircrafts. Like I mentioned earlier in the episode, he loved vintage aircrafts and aircrafts that required work or required modifications. That was a whole subset of this aviation hobby that he just couldn't get enough of. And that's why a specific aircraft caught his eye in September of 1997, just over a year after his license was formally revoked. This aircraft was a Rutten Long EZ. It was home built by its previous owner, which intrigued John, of course. And John Denver paid approximately $56,000 for this experimental aircraft on September 27th, 1997. He repainted it close to where it was bought and then flew it to Santa Maria before ferrying it to Monterey. Within days of it arriving in Monterey, John Denver reportedly took it on several very short orientation flights. You know, like when you rent a car and you just kind of drive around the parking lot and hit the gas and then hit the brakes really fast just to see how it works. Those type of flights. And it was quickly apparent that there were several modifications done to this aircraft that seemed, at the very least, peculiar, and at the very most, extremely dangerous, all of which pertained to the aircraft's fuel. The first weird and dangerously risky modification had to do with the aircraft's fuel selector, which a fuel selector is a manual control valve that allows the pilot to choose which fuel tank is feeding the engine. On the original Rutten design, the fuel selector was located between the pilot's legs and was very easy to reach. However, on this homemade aircraft, the fuel selector had been relocated to behind the pilot's left shoulder, which would be much harder to locate and access mid-flight. On the original aircraft's design, the fuel gauges were also visible to the pilot by simply looking forward to the left or the right of the dashboard in front of them. Whereas on the homemade aircraft design that John Denver bought, the fuel gauges were located behind the pilot and were also not marked. If he wanted to check them during the flight, he had, or even during the pre-flight checklist, he had to use a mirror to see it. And even then, they weren't very visible, weren't clearly marked, and it was just a very, very poor design. Before the flight on October 12th, Denver had reportedly came up with the short-term solution of using pliers to help him access the fuel gauge mid-flight should he need to do so. In fact, he was actually seen using those pliers before a flight on October 11th. He used pliers to switch the fuel tank from one tank to the other. If it wasn't October 11th, it was a few days before October 12th that he used those pliers. Even so, even using pliers to reach it, he still had to twist backwards and brace himself in a very awkward position to be able to even reach the pliers to the valve. And then once you see the valve, the options are left, which draws fuel from the left tank only, right, which would switch it to draw from the right fuel tank. Both or all is an option that would obviously allow fuel from both tanks to the engine. And then there was an option for off, which would shut off fuel to the engine completely. In every other aircraft, because this is such a vital part of the plane, this valve is always extremely easily accessible to the pilot, and often is right between their legs, like it was in the original design of this Rutten aircraft. So this was highly unusual that a pilot would have to do this. John Denver had expressed his desire to change this design. It was actually one of the first changes he wanted to make to the aircraft, but he also wanted to fly the aircraft a few more times to see what other changes he might want to make before he started tearing the whole thing apart and doing this full renovation. It was just 15 days after purchasing the aircraft, John decided to take the pleasure flight, intended only for practice and touch-and-go landings at the Monterey Peninsula Airport. He knew he didn't have a pilot's license, but he didn't intend to go far. He was excited about this new purchase, and he just wanted to further familiarize himself with it. At approximately 5:00 p.m. on October 12th, 1997, a line service technician helped John Denver pull the Long Easy out of its hangar. He recalls asking John if he wanted to refuel, to which John said no, that wasn't necessary because he only planned to be in the air about an hour at most. The flight technician was right there as John Denver performed his pre-flight checks and says that the pre-flight checks lasted about 20 minutes. However, he noted when John was checking the fuel for water contamination and for proper levels, John, again, had to use a mirror to see the fuel gauges and was looking in the reflection in the mirror to see if he had enough fuel. But again, it wasn't clearly marked and was also really just not very visible at all. Usually they are clear tubes and you can clearly see how much fuel you have. And with this specific plane, it was very difficult to tell. John reportedly made another comment to the technician in this moment, where he again reiterated how awful the fuel gauge placements were, and he told him that he had used pliers before to manipulate the fuel handles. And he even said, I have the pliers right here, ready to use them again if I need to. But John ultimately chose to proceed with the flight, knowing he was unable to precisely measure the levels of fuel. He also did not file a flight plan, which is just good practice to do, even if you are planning to go a very short distance. But John was pretty much saying, no, I'm just going to do touch and go landings, maybe be in the air for less than an hour. No need to do it. John Denver departed the runway at 5:12 p.m. He did 3 touch-and-go landings at the airport and then flew up and started to go west over the Pacific. Witnesses say they heard a pop, likely an engine sputter as a result of fuel starvation. Now, this could have been from one of the tanks or both. I tried to find out whether the fuel gauge was set on left or right or both at the time of takeoff, and I could not find that detail. So it could have been one, it could have been the other, or it could have been both tanks that ran out of fuel. But then the witnesses say something a little interesting. They say they saw the plane spiral into the ocean at 5:28 p.m., about 150 yards offshore of Pacific Grove, California. Now, this is interesting. It's an interesting fact that the plane went into a spiral formation, because that would mean that the right rudder pedal of the aircraft would have had to have been pressed. Some people believe that John Denver did this on purpose, while others believe he simply realized one of the fuel tanks had gone to empty. He heard the engine sputter, heard the pop himself. He turned to do all of the gymnastics required to switch the tank from left to right or vice versa. And in the process of awkwardly twisting and turning, he inadvertently hit the right rudder pedal, throwing the aircraft into a spin. Others twisted, no pun intended, this theory, saying he could have purposely twisted the fuel gauges to off, cutting off all power to the engine, and then purposefully threw the plane into a spiral into the ocean. I mean, yes, John certainly had faced a few very difficult years, and his license had been taken away, which was incredibly hard for him to accept, but family and friends close to him insisted he was not intending to do this. They insisted this was 100% a tragic accident caused by fuel mismanagement, a poor cockpit design, and pilot distraction, not pilot's intent. In fact, they said John Denver had been proactively taking steps to reapply for his pilot's medical certificate, indicating future plans and optimism. So why do people keep questioning this? For one thing, the crash appeared extremely sudden and steep, with no distress calls made. Some found it a little odd that he wouldn't file a flight plan before taking off if he did end up going up over the Pacific. And people also find it hard to accept that he wasn't concerned about refueling or properly checking the fuel levels, such basic parts of a pre-flight check, especially for someone who was the son of an Air Force pilot and was so knowledgeable when it came to flights. Now, the biggest part of this story, and something that is rarely mentioned or talked about, and it's something I want to bring up because it is extremely important to this timeline. If you remember his second DUI charge, which was dismissed in June of 1995 due to the double jeopardy argument that John's attorney had made, well, in the late spring, early summer of 1997, same year as the crash, the prosecution for this second DUI charge actually appealed that 1995 dismissal, and the appeal had gone through. And in July of 1997, they were all back in court in front of a jury. John Denver was reportedly extremely upset that he had to go back to court for something that had happened in 1994. He had to go back in 1997 to talk about this DUI charge, to defend himself again, this time in front of a jury. This time his fate was in the hands of a jury, and it could still result in 12 months in jail. The trial ended in July with a hung jury, 3-3, guilty, not guilty. A retrial was scheduled for later that year in 1997. But of course, after October 12th, the case was permanently closed, considering John Denver had tragically passed away. This sent fans into an even further frenzy, feeling like maybe John did do this to intentionally avoid this retrial and to just put himself out of this legal pain that had seemingly endlessly been haunting him for years. John also hadn't been part of any kind of aircraft incident since, if you count the incident that happened in 1989, when he was in a 1931 biplane that he was piloting, and that plane just simply spun around while taxiing at an airport in northern Arizona. And it was a very, very windy day that day, and many people say the plane just hit wind and spun. It was a very minor mishap that everyone walked away from uninjured, and there had been no incidents since then with John and any other plane. On October 13th, 1997, that Monday morning, John Denver was the front page news story of almost every major newspaper in America. Headlines reading simply, "John Denver dies in crash." John Denver was 53 at the time of this crash and was only identified thanks to fingerprints that were sent in from Colorado, where he had been living part-time in addition to his residence in Carmel Highlands. The National Transportation Safety Board investigator on the case was a man named George Pedersen. He said the wreckage was in about 50 feet of water, very difficult to get to. John's body was flown back to Colorado, where he was then cremated. A private memorial service was held on October 17th at Faith Presbyterian Church in Aurora, Colorado, followed by a celebration of his life the next day in Aspen. His ashes were later scattered over the Rocky Mountains, fulfilling his deep connection to the region that inspired much of his music. So the next time you are driving through the Rocky Mountains, or even just out there enjoying nature, no matter where you are, I hope you remember John Denver and his deep love for this country, the world, and life in general. If you like this type of content, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You also have the option to give the channel a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel and the research that goes into these episodes. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.